The community center smelled of coffee and wet coats, and it was full of men the world had learned to look past. It was a stand down. If you have never heard the term, it is one of the quietly decent things this country does, now and then, for the people it forgets the rest of the year. Once in a while, a town will throw open the doors of a gymnasium or a community hall and invite every homeless veteran in the county inside. There is a hot meal. There are clean socks and warm coats. There are folding tables where tired volunteers help old soldiers untangle the knots of paperwork that stand between them and the help they earned a long time ago. For one day, the men the world walks past are treated, again, like the men they used to be. On this particular gray morning, in this particular hall, among the folding tables and the steam trays and the rows of donated boots, there was also a dog. He was a German shepherd, old now, with a gray muzzle and calm, ancient eyes, and he wore the best of a therapy dog. He moved through the crowd of broken men at the end of a gentle lead, held by a young woman in a volunteer's shirt, and everywhere he went, something softened. Hard men who had not let another living soul touch them in years reached out with shaking hands to lay a palm on his warm back. That was his job now, this old dog. That was his whole purpose. To go among the wounded and let them remember, for a moment, what it felt like to be gentle. And near the door, half in and half out, stood a man who had almost not come inside at all. His name, though no one there knew it, was Eddie Marsh. He was somewhere past 60, though he looked older, the way the street ages a man. His beard was gray and wild, his coat was army surplus gone black with grime, and he stood with the particular stillness of a man who has taught himself to disappear. He had come only for the meal, and he had almost turned around twice at the door, because crowds were hard for him, and kindness was harder, and both together were almost more than he could stand. He was working up the nerve to leave when he saw the dog. Eddie Marsh went very, very still. He stared across that crowded room at the old gray shepherd, and the coffee cup in his hand began to tremble, and then to shake, until it slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor, and he did not even notice. Because Eddie Marsh knew that dog. And knowing him was impossible. And yet, the volunteer with the lead noticed the ragged old man staring, and, like most people, she felt a small flicker of wariness. But before she could do anything, the homeless man had begun to move across the room toward her dog, pushing through the crowd, his eyes locked on the animal, tears already cutting clean tracks down his filthy face. Men stepped aside. Somebody said, "Easy, friend." The volunteer tightened her hand on the lead, uncertain, half ready to pull the dog back. Eddie Marsh reached the old shepherd and lowered himself down onto his knees on the gymnasium floor, his bad legs folding under him with a grunt of pain, until he was face to face with the dog. And he leaned in close, and out of a throat ruined by years of silence and cold, he whispered a single word. It was not a word anyone else in that room understood. It was not even English. It was one short, strange word in a foreign tongue, spoken so softly that only the dog could have heard it. And what that old dog did next stopped every single person in that hall cold. I am going to tell you what that word was, and what it meant, and why an entire room of hardened, forgotten men fell silent and then wept at the sound of it. But first you have to understand what that dog once did for that man, in the worst hour of his life, in a country on the other side of the world. So stay with me, all the way to the end. Because some debts are never forgotten, not by man and not by dog, and this is the story of one of them. The man on his knees on that gymnasium floor had once been someone the whole world would have been proud to know. Eddie Marsh had been a soldier for most of his adult life. Not an officer, not a hero on any recruiting poster, just the kind of steady, dependable non-commissioned man who was the actual backbone of every army that has ever marched. He was a team leader. He was the one the younger men looked to when things went bad. He was the one who checked their gear, and read their letters when they were homesick, and stood between them and the worst of the world as best a man can. He had done 3 tours. 3 times he had gone to the war and come home again, and each time he came home a little heavier, carrying a little more of the weight that a man in that job accumulates and can never quite set back down. The weight of the ones who did not come home. The weight of the split-second decisions that a man replays for the rest of his life. The weight of having seen the things that human beings are not built to see, and of having no place to put them once he was home in the quiet. Eddie carried that weight the way his whole generation was taught to carry it. In silence. He did not talk about the war. He did not ask for help, because in his world asking for help was a kind of surrender, and Eddie Marsh did not surrender. He locked it all away in a room inside himself, and he threw away the key, and he told himself that was strength. It was not strength. It was a poison. And it would take him years to understand that. But before all of that, before the silence and the fall, there was one day. The worst day. The day Eddie Marsh should have died on a dusty road 10,000 miles from home, and did not. And the reason he did not die that day was the old gray dog now standing before him on a gymnasium floor. To tell that story, I have to tell you about the dog. His name was Rico. He was a German shepherd, but not the soft, sloping kind you see in a suburban backyard. He was a Czech-line dog, bred from generations of hard-working animals in a country far from where he would serve, an animal built for one purpose, courageous and brilliant and because he had come up through that lineage, Rico had been trained, from his very first days, in the commands of that old country. He did not take his orders in English. He took them in Czech, the language of the men who had first shaped him, and only a handful of people in the whole American military knew the words that would move him. Rico was a military working dog, and like all of his kind, his job was to walk into death ahead of the men, and find it, and save them. He and his handler, a young sergeant, were attached to Eddie Marsh's unit during Eddie's final tour. And in the way of these things, the dog quickly became something more than a piece of equipment to the men he protected. He became one of them. He became, in the strange fierce fellowship of a war zone, a friend. Eddie was not Rico's handler. He wants me to be clear about that, wherever he is now, because he always was. He never wanted to take credit for a bond that belonged first to that young sergeant. Eddie was just one of the soldiers Rico walked in front of, one of the many men that dog kept alive without their ever quite knowing how close death had come. But Eddie had a soft spot for the dog, and the dog for him, in the quiet hours. Eddie would share his rations. He would sit with Rico in the shade during the long hot waits, and talk to him low, the way lonely men talk to animals, saying things he could never say to another human being. He even learned a few of the dog's strange foreign words. Just a handful, picked up from the young sergeant, the words that made Rico sit, and lie down, and hold. And there was one word above all the others that Eddie learned, one word he would carry in his heart for the rest of his life, though he did not know it yet on those easy afternoons in the shade. The word was Zustan. In the dog's old language, it meant stay. Just that. Stay. Remember it. Because that one small word is the hinge on which this whole story turns. It happened on a road that looked like every other road. I am not going to dwell on the violence of it, because this is not a story about violence, it is a story about what love does in the aftermath of violence. So I will tell you only what you need to know. Eddie Marsh's patrol was hit. In an instant, on an ordinary morning, the world came apart in fire and noise, and when the noise stopped, Eddie Marsh was on the ground, gravely wounded, bleeding into the dust, and unable to move. He was, for a time, alone with his own dying. And any soldier who has been in that place will tell you it is the loneliest place there is. The strange quiet that comes after the blast. The certainty, cold and clear, that this is the spot where it ends. Eddie lay there in the dirt, his life running out of him, 10,000 miles from home, and he did the thing men do in that moment. He thought of the people he loved, and he began, quietly, to let go. And then something warm pressed against his side. It was Rico. In the chaos and the smoke, the dog had come to him. Whether by training or by something deeper than training, that dog had found the wounded man on the ground and had lain down against him, pressing his whole body along Eddie's side, covering him, warming him, anchoring him. And somewhere nearby, through the ringing in his ears, Eddie could hear the young sergeant shouting for a medic, working to hold back the tide, and shouting to his dog too, commands in that strange old language. Eddie was slipping. He could feel himself going, the cold coming up from his feet, the light at the edges going gray. And in his fading, half-dreaming mind, one clear thought rose up above all the others. He did not want to die alone. Whatever else happened, he did not want to be alone when it came. And so Eddie Marsh turned his head, and looked into the dark eyes of the dog pressed against him, and with the last of the breath in his body, he begged him, in the one word he had, the dog's own word, the word that meant stay. "Zeuston," Eddie whispered. "Zeuston. Please. Stay." And Rico stayed. That dog did not move. Through the chaos, through the noise, through the long, terrible wait for the helicopter that would either come in time or not, Rico stayed pressed against the dying man, exactly where Eddie had begged him to be, refusing every instinct that must have screamed at him to flee the fire and the blood. He stayed. He gave Eddie the one thing the man had asked for. He made it so that Eddie Marsh, in what he was certain were the last minutes of his life, was not alone. The medics said afterward that the dog's warmth, the dog's weight, the simple animal fact of that steady heartbeat pressed against him, was very likely part of what kept Eddie's own heart beating until the helicopter came. The mind holds on, they said, when the body wants to quit, if it has a reason. And Eddie Marsh's reason, in that dust, was a dog who had promised, in the only way a dog can promise, that he would not leave. Eddie lived. They got him out. And in the blur of medicine and surgery and the long flight home that followed, he lost track of everything and everyone from that road, including the dog who had saved him. He never got to say goodbye. He never got to say thank you. One day Rico was pressed against his side, keeping death away by the sheer stubborn fact of his presence, and the next, Eddie was gone, swept up and away, and the dog was left behind in the war. Eddie assumed, the way you assume about all the things the war swallows, that he would never see the dog again. For years and years, he was right. Now I have to tell you about the years that broke Eddie Marsh. And I have to tell them gently, and honestly, because they are the years that so many who serve fall into, and there is no shame in any of it, only a sorrow that we as a country have still not learned how to answer. Eddie came home a wounded man, in his body and in the part of him that no surgeon could reach. And he did what he had always done. He locked it away. He refused to talk about the road, or the men he had lost, or the long minutes he had spent dying in the dust. He told himself he was fine. He told everyone he was fine. And the poison he had sealed inside himself went on quietly doing its work. The nightmares came first. Then the days when he could not make himself leave the house. Then the terrible startle at every loud sound, the way a slammed door would put him on the floor with his heart hammering, back on that road. He pushed people away, because that was easier than letting them see. He lost the woman who loved him, because he could not let her in. He lost job after job. He lost, one handhold at a time, over years, every single thing that anchors a man to the ordinary world. And underneath all of it, driving him down, was a thing heavier than any wound. Guilt. The particular, bottomless guilt of the man who lived when others did not. Eddie Marsh had come home. Some of his men had not. And there is a certain kind of soldier who can never quite forgive himself for that, who feels that his own survival was a theft, who punishes himself for it in 1,000 quiet ways for the rest of his life. Eddie was that kind of soldier. He did not believe, in the deepest part of himself, that he deserved a warm bed or a soft word or a hand reaching out to help him. He believed he deserved the cold. So when the cold finally came, when he ran out of handholds and people and places to go, some ruined part of Eddie Marsh almost welcomed it. He went to the street the way a man goes to a penance. And he stayed there, invisible, punishing himself, for years, refusing every hand that reached for him, because he did not believe he was worth saving. He had forgotten, in all those hard years, the one lesson that a dog had taught him in the dust on the worst day of his life. That sometimes the whole meaning of love is simply this: that someone stays. That someone refuses to leave, no matter how bad it gets, whether or not you think you deserve it. He had forgotten. But the dog had not. And the dog was about to remind him. While Eddie Marsh was falling, the dog named Rico was living a whole second life, and then a third, and it is worth telling, because it is what brought him to that gymnasium on that gray morning. Rico served out his years in the war, and he served them with honor, and when his working days were finally done, he came home to his country to a well-earned retirement. But Rico was not a dog who could simply lie in the sun. There was too much in him, too much heart, too much need to be of use. And so the people who cared for him found him a new purpose, a third career for an old soldier. They made him a therapy dog. And not just any therapy dog. They trained him and certified him to do the most fitting work imaginable for a dog like him. They set him to comforting veterans. Broken men, wounded men, men lost in the same darkness that had swallowed Eddie Marsh. Rico spent his golden years going among them, into the hospitals and the clinics and the outreach halls, laying his gray head on the knees of soldiers who had not felt a gentle touch in years, letting them bury their faces in his fur and weep for the things they could not say. He was extraordinary at it. The people who handled him said they had never seen a dog with such a gift for finding the most wounded man in any room and going straight to him. It was as if Rico could smell the particular pain of a soldier, the specific wound that he himself had once helped to prevent, out there on the roads of the war. And in his own quiet way, he was still doing the same job he had always done. He was still walking toward the danger inside these men now, and standing beside them in it, so that they would not have to face it alone. His handlers noticed one thing about him, though, that they could never quite explain. In every crowded room, in every hall full of veterans, Rico searched. His old head would come up and he would scan the faces, one after another, every single one, with a focus that seemed almost like longing. As if, among all these lost soldiers he had come to comfort, he was hoping to find one in particular. One face. One scent. One man he had lain beside, long ago, in the dust of a road on the other side of the world, and had never been able to say goodbye to. For years, in room after room, he searched, and did not find him. Until a gray morning at a stand-down, in a gymnasium that smelled of coffee and wet coats, when an old homeless man he had almost missed in the crowd turned and looked at him, and the search of a lifetime finally ended. Eddie Marsh had not wanted to come. He had heard about the stand-down from another man under the overpass, a fellow veteran who had gone the year before and come back with warm boots and a full stomach. Eddie had resisted for days. Crowds. Kindness. Paperwork. Questions. All the things he had spent years learning to avoid. But it was a cold season, and he was hungry, and some small unkillable ember of the man he used to be, had finally pushed him through those doors. And now he was on his knees on a gymnasium floor, and the impossible was happening. He knew that dog. Older now, grayer now, movinger now, but Eddie Marsh would have known that dog anywhere, in any life, at the end of the world. There was no mistaking the shape of him, the set of his ears, the specific darkness of those ancient eyes. The dog who would lean against his side while he died and refused to die. The dog whose steady heartbeat had held Eddie's own heart beating through the longest minutes of his life. The dog he had begged, in one foreign word, to stay. Rico. It could not be. Across a whole world, across all those years, across everything that had happened to both of them. It could not be. And yet Eddie Marsh looked into those eyes, and those eyes looked back into his, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his ruined core, that it was. So he had crossed the room. And he had gone down on his knees, though it cost his broken body dearly to do it. And now he knelt face to face with the dog who had saved his life, weeping like he had not wept in 40 years, and the whole hall had gone quiet and wary around this ragged stranger, and the young volunteer had her hand tied on the lead, unsure, half afraid. And Eddie Marsh leaned in close to the old grey shepherd, and out of the deepest and most broken place in himself, he whispered the one word he had carried in his heart since the worst day of his life. The word that had meant, "Do not leave me." The word that had meant, "I do not want to die alone." The dog's own word, in the dog's own old language, the word that meant, simply, "Stay." "Zeuston," Eddie Marsh whispered. "Zeuston, boy. It's me. It's me." And the old dog came apart. At the sound of that word, that strange old foreign word that not one other soul in that hall could understand, something detonated inside the old dog. His ears shot up. His whole graying body went rigid, electric, and for one heartbeat he stood frozen, as if the sound had reached back through all the years to something buried so deep it had almost been forgotten. And then recognition broke over him like a wave, and Rico stopped being a calm old therapy dog and became, all at once, the animal who had once lain in the dust and refused to leave a dying man. He surged forward against the lead, and the young volunteer, understanding now that something was happening here far beyond her, let it go. And Rico threw himself the last few feet into Eddie Marsh, and he did the one thing, the only thing, the thing he had done on that road 10,000 miles away and a lifetime ago. He pressed his whole body against the old soldier's side. He leaned into him with all his weight, exactly as he had in the dust, and he laid himself against the man and would not be moved, and the sounds that came out of that old dog were sounds that broke the hearts of every hardened man in that room. He was doing it again. He was staying. Eddie had said the word that meant stay, and the dog was answering it the only way he knew how, with his whole body, with his whole faithful heart. "Whatever it means, whatever you need, I will not leave you. Not on that road. Not in this room. Not ever." Eddie Marsh wrapped both arms around the dog who had saved his life, buried his weeping face in that gray fur, and 40 years of locked-away grief poured out of him at once, all the silence and the guilt and the cold, all of it breaking free at last into the warm body of the one soul on this earth who had once refused to let him die. "You stayed," Eddie sobbed into the dog's neck. "You stayed with me. You stayed." And the whole hall had gone silent. A room full of the most broken, hardened, forgotten men in the county, men who had not shown a soft feeling in years, stood frozen and watched an old homeless soldier and an old war dog hold each other on a gymnasium floor, and there was not a dry eye among them. Because every man in that room knew. Not the details, not yet. But every one of them knew, in his own scarred heart, exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at the thing they had all been searching for and had all stopped believing in. He was looking at a love that had crossed a whole world and 40 years of pain and refused, absolutely refused, to be forgotten. They were looking, those forgotten men, at proof that they were not forgettable after all. The story came outly, in the tender hours that followed, and it moved through that hall and then through that town like a fire through dry grass. The dog's handlers, who had wondered for years at the searching in their old therapy dog, understood it at last. All that time, in room after room of wounded veterans, Rico had been looking for one particular man. The one he had lain beside in the dust. The one he had never been able to say goodbye to. He had comforted 1,000 broken soldiers on his long road, and all the while, some faithful part of him had been searching every one of their faces for the face of the man he had once kept alive with his own body. And on that gray morning, at a stand down for the homeless and the forgotten, he had finally found him. And the men in that hall, the volunteers, the whole town one had heard, would not let it end there. Because you cannot watch a thing like that and go back to walking past a man like Eddie Marsh. It is not possible. They had seen him now. They had seen the whole man he was, and the whole man he had been, the team leader, the soldier who dragged his men through the fire, the human being who had lain dying in the dust and been saved by a dog's refusal to leave. They could not unsee it. And so they did for Eddie Marsh what that dog had done for him on the road so long ago. They stayed. The veterans organizations that ran the stand down took Eddie's hand, gently, and this time he did not pull it away, because something in him had finally broken open enough to let a little help come in. They found him a warm place to sleep that very night, and then a real place to live, in the weeks that followed. They found him care for the wound inside him, the wound he had carried in silence for 40 years, and, with more patience than he believed he deserved, they began to help him set that weight down at last. And the guilt that had driven him to the cold, the terrible belief that he did not deserve to be saved, began, for the first time, to loosen its grip. Because it is very hard to go on believing you are worthless when an old dog crosses a crowded room to find you, after searching for you for years. And Rico, the old dog who had spent his golden years comforting broken soldiers, one after another, was given, at long last, one soldier of his very own. Eddie Marsh and Rico got their years after all. Not the years the war stole. Those were gone, buried in the dust of a road far away, and no one could give them back. But the quiet years, the gentle years, the years after all the fighting was finally over, those they got to spend together. The people who cared for Rico understood, once they knew the whole story, that this old dog had one last piece of work to do, the most important work of his long life, and that it could only be done at Eddie Marsh's side. And so they arranged it, in the careful way these things are arranged, and the old war dog went home to the old soldier he had saved. What that dog did for Eddie in those last years, no doctor and no medicine had been able to do in all the years before. Rico gave the broken man a reason to get up in the morning. He gave him a warm body to come home to, a living heart that needed him and loved him without condition and asked nothing in return but his company. Men who work with wounded veterans will tell you that this, in the end, is the medicine that so often works when nothing else will. Not a pill. Not a program. A faithful creature who stays. Who simply, stubbornly, refuses to leave. Eddie began to heal. It was, and it was not always easy, and the war never fully let him go, the way it never does. But it is one thing to carry your wounds alone in the cold under an overpass, and another thing entirely to carry them in a warm home with an old dog asleep against your side, breathing and steady in the dark, the same steady heartbeat that had once held your own heart beating in the dust. Eddie was not alone anymore. And it turned out that had been the whole of it, all along. He had never needed to earn his way back into the world. He had only needed someone to stay. And Rico, at the very last, stopped searching. The people who had handled him for years marveled at the peace that came over the old dog in that final chapter. Gone was the restless scanning of every face in every room. Gone was the searching. He had found his man. His long work was done. And Rico spent his last seasons lying contentedly at Eddie Marsh's feet in a warm and quiet home, an old soldier at rest beside an old soldier, both of them finally safe. When the end came for Rico, as it comes for all these faithful hearts far too soon, he went the way every one of them deserves to go. Old, and warm, and loved, with his gray head resting against the side of the man he had saved twice over, once in a war and once in a gymnasium. And Eddie Marsh held him through that last quiet night, and pressed his own body against the dog's the way the dog had once pressed against his, and he whispered the old word into that gray fur one final time. Not a command now. A promise, returned at last, from the man to the dog. Zustan, Eddie whispered. I've got you, boy. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Zustan. He stayed. To the very end, he stayed. The way the dog had taught him. The way love, real love, always does. So that is the story of a homeless veteran and the one word that brought his brother back. Of everything in it, of the whole long journey through war and guilt and all those cold and forgotten years, here is the moment I cannot let go of. It is that gymnasium floor. It is the sight of a broken man on his knees, whispering a single strange word into the ear of an old dog, in a language no one else in the room could understand. And it is what that word did. How one word, spoken with love, reached back across 40 years and 10,000 miles and called two lost souls all the way home to each other. Zustan. Stay. Of all the words in all the languages of the world, was there ever one that carried more? Because that, in the end, is the whole of what these faithful creatures come into our lives to teach us. Eddie Marsh spent 40 years believing he did not deserve to be saved. He punished himself with the cold, pushed away every hand that reached for him, certain in the deepest part of himself that he was not worth the trouble of staying for. And it took an old dog, crossing a crowded room to find the one man he had been searching for his whole life, to finally prove him wrong. You are worth staying for. That is what that dog said, without a single word of his own. You always were. There is someone in your life, maybe, who has stayed. When it was hard, when you gave them every reason to go, when you did not believe you deserved it, someone refused to leave. Whether they walk on 2 legs or on 4, do not let this day end without letting them know that you saw it. That you know what it cost. That it was, and is, the truest gift anyone can give another. To stay. And if you have ever walked past a ragged old man at the edge of a room and looked away, remember Eddie Marsh. Remember that the invisible man in the surplus coat was somebody once. A leader. A protector. A soldier who lay dying in the dust of a faraway road and was saved by a dog who would not leave him. You never know what whole war, what whole love, what whole life, is locked away inside the person you are trying not to see. Look a little closer. You might be looking at a hero. If this story touched your heart, do me a kindness and leave a comment below. Tell me about someone who stayed for you when you needed them most, and tell me their name. I read every single one, and those stories are the whole reason I do this. And if you believe, the way I do, that a loyalty like this deserves to be remembered, then give this video a like so more people get to hear it, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded today that they are worth staying for. If you are new here, and you love true stories about loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between people and the dogs who would cross the whole world to find them, then subscribe and stay with us. Every week, I bring you another story, told all the way through, from beginning to end. Next time, I want to tell you about an old retired canine, living out his quiet years on a farm, who woke his family in the dead of night barking at a locked door that had never once been opened, and would not stop, until they finally understood what he had been trying to tell them all along. Until then, be the one who stays.